So I want to welcome everybody to the July 16th NVTC WMATA committee meeting. Apologies for the delays and thank you for bearing with us as we figured out some of the technology aspects of all of this. My name is Kanek Aguirre. I'm the chair for the NVTC WMATA committee. And of course, we're having this meeting electronically due to the COVID-19 public health emergency. We're able to do so because of the bill that was signed into law on April 22nd by Governor Northam, to allow public bodies to meet electronically without a physical quorum present to discuss or transact the business statutorily required or necessary to continue operations of that public body. NVTC staff follow the procedures and guidelines in the legislative amendment to give notice to the committee, commission, staff, and the public. Commissioners and staff have called in using an audio teleconferencing platform while the meeting is simultaneously being broadcast to the public on YouTube. The only visual component of this meeting is the presentation slides, which are being shown to those on WebEx, and it looks like we've got those up and working, as well as on the YouTube stream. I also want to acknowledge that NVTC Chair Katie Crystal will be joining us tonight to discuss the 3% cap working group. In order to help the meeting run as smoothly as possible, I think we're all kind of pros at this now, so we'll waive some of the procedural stuff. Just remember, whenever you guys speak up, I could see you, but if you don't mind just saying who you are and identifying yourself so we know which jurisdiction and everything. Please remember to stay muted while not talking, and then we'll kind of take it from there. Andrew, if you don't mind, our NVTC WMATA program manager, if you'll take the role for us.
Thank you, Chair Aguirre. Let's see, Mr. Di Ferranti.
Here.
Mr. Letourneau.
Here.
Mr. Meyer.
Here.
Mr. Smedberg.
Present.
Mr. Snyder. And for other commissioners who are in attendance, currently have Chair Crystal.
Present.
Ms. Palchik.
Present.
And if you all will indulge me, since I can't move my mouse to see all of you, did we have Mr. Turner?
That's right. Mike Turner's on. Hi, all.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And I saw previously Senator Bell.
I am here.
And is there anyone I missed?
Delegate Krizak.
Thank you, Delegate Krizak. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. And I will now identify, so we do have a quorum. I will now identify staff and include their titles for the benefit of the listening public. I am WMATA Program Manager Andrew DeVetter. We also have our Executive Director, Kate Mattice, on the line. Program Analyst Zach Smith, Melissa Walker, our IT managers, helping us as well. And I do want to note that on the WebEx, we also have Regina Sullivan with WMATA. So at this point, I will turn it back over to the chair.
Thank you so much, Andrew. According to the legislation signed by Governor Northam in response to the COVID-19 public health emergency, a public body or governing board convening a meeting during the declared emergency shall provide the public an opportunity to comment. In advance of this meeting, NVTC solicited written comments. Staff captured public comments via Google Forms and NVTC's website. Comments received by 3 p.m. today were provided to commissioners ahead of the meeting. Andrew, if you don't mind sharing some of the comments with us?
Sorry to get off mute. So we did receive 3 comments. One comment was regarding which I forwarded to the committee members and several commissioners prior to the meeting. If my other staff colleagues who have that can send it to the other commissioners who attended that, I would appreciate that. The comments were in regards to having enough capacity on Metrobus to have safe social distancing, the OIG report on Silverline Phase 2 panels, and then the last report was imploring the committee not to change the 3% cap as it is vital for cost control at WMATA. And so for you all, we'll forward that as we have already, and to those who haven't received it, you should be getting it shortly. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Next, I'd like to officially welcome Mr. DeFerranti to the WMATA committee as the newest representative from Arlington County. So Mr. DeFerranti, officially welcome as a city member now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'd also like to acknowledge the rest of the NVTC staff who are working behind the scenes to make this meeting a success because we know how much work goes into this, and adding the technology component to it is not easy. So I'd like to turn now to our first agenda item for the April 30th NVTC WMATA committee meeting summary. Do we have any committee members that have any changes or comments on the summary? Going once, going twice. I think we were good on that one. So, yeah, okay. Just making sure I was checking people's facial expressions to see if they wanted to make any comments. But moving on to our second agenda item, the work session on the 2020 update of the annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. At our April meeting, the committee was asked to provide guidance on staff's approach to updating the annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA. This report provides key financial, reliability, and performance data, as well as the uses of Virginia's dedicated capital funding to WMATA. Because of the COVID-19 public health emergency, the committee directed staff to make a major update to the report by providing context for COVID-19 related data and policy impacts. Staff has incorporated our comments from the previous discussion to present what the update will look like. As a reminder, this is the final work session on the annual report before we review a final draft in the fall, sending the report to the commission and subsequently to the General Assembly by the December 15th due date. Andrew, if you don't mind taking item number 2.
All right, thank you, Chairman Aguirre. I'll now go over a slide deck covering the update to the annual report. This is being shown on the screen and was provided in advance on the website. I'll ask commissioners hold their questions until we reach the discussion portion of the slides, and then the chair will manage the conversation at that point. Okay, so for the annual report, just since we have some new faces here who aren't as familiar with the background, the 2018 transit omnibus legislation in Virginia that created the dedicated funding also has NVTC producing an annual report to the governor on the performance and the condition of WMATA. In order to take on these new duties, we updated our bylaws and charged this committee to give staff guidance as we do that annual update. We've done 2 of these so far, and this is the 3rd report, the 2020 report. The legislation has us looking at 6 areas, which are conveniently chapters in the report, as shown on your screen. The last 4 are the data chapters, which we use publicly available data from the National Transit Database and some of Metro's performance reports to populate those fields in the report. The second chapter here is the uses on the dedicated capital funds, and so we show the expenditures of those funds on certain program areas at WMATA, and that information is provided to us by WMATA. And then the chapter that we're here to talk about tonight is the strategies to reduce the growth in costs and improve operational efficiency. And this doesn't really draw any data per se, but it is a policy decision by the commission. So as I said, this is the 3rd report, and so we've really learned a lot over the last 2 major first report and then the update. What we heard from the committee, which feels like light years ago, but it was on April 30th, was to do a pretty significant update to the report for the impacts related to COVID-19. So we'll add an introduction, show WMATA's recovery efforts, which are obviously, changing as time moves on. We will highlight relevant COVID-19 related impacts in each chapter and highlight any strategies that are to improve costs and efficiency that are COVID-19 recovery related. And then really just thematically what we heard from the committee was to give that context to the report in December, which is a long way away. But we want to make sure that what goes to the governor and the General Assembly really hits the mark to the appropriate context at the time, and also lays the groundwork for future reports. There's a data lag in some of the data. It references years past, and so highlighting data in this report will highlight years that are impacted by COVID for many, many years. And then the other major update here, which is a proposal for the committee tonight, is to restructure the strategies chapter, and this is really aimed at streamlining the annual update process. As I said, we've learned a lot over the last 2 years. So what we're doing is carrying over and reorganizing previous strategies, updating these for relevant NVTC policies, 2 of which have occurred in the last year, the privatization of services and the bus transformation project, and then consolidating previous recommendations that overlapped. What we want to do is restructure into 4 broad categories that should look familiar. These are rebuilding rail and bus ridership, improving operational efficiency of rail and bus, increasing non-fare revenues, and controlling cost escalation and enhancing the efficiency of the workforce and contracted services. Within each of these broad categories, we would like to restructure it into 2 buckets. And so the first is recommendations by NVTC. This is specific actions that the Commission recommends WMATA take or consider. This is really an area for the Commission to make that kind of policy decision. And then the second is ongoing efforts at WMATA that support previous recommendations. And so these are things that don't really have an end date. We'll have some examples in the next few slides. And our intent here is to document WMATA's accomplishments or progress in these areas, since a lot of these things don't end. And just as an example to show the committee, this is the first bucket, the rebuilding rail and bus ridership. And so these recommendations on the left are all either carryovers or consolidated from the last year's report. In some cases, no change. In some cases, we, as on the right, have indicated where we've consolidated something. And then on the ongoing efforts, these are things, again, that don't have an end. And so we've given just an example of a few things that have happened in the last year that sort of fit these categories. And so this is the tracking component that I mentioned previously. For the committee's reference, in the materials packet that was provided ahead, there is a 3-page Word document that has the full chapter outline, so more than just those 2 slides. And we note where there's been a notable change, either if there's no change, something was consolidated, or just slightly wordsmithed to reflect WMATA's ability to take action on something. So at this point, Chairman Aguirre, I will turn it back to you for any comments or discussion. And then after that, there's 2 next step slides that I'll go over.
Thank you, Andrew. I wanted to give, if there's any other NVTC staff that wanted to make any remarks, I wanted to give them a chance real fast. No?
I just have one. This is Paul.
Mr. Smedberg.
Thank you. Andrew, could we go back 1 slide real quick? We have the Kids Ride Free program with Montgomery County. Do we have an estimate for this, if not WMATA paying for this?
I'm sorry, Paul, there was a bit of an interruption there. Can you repeat your question?
I said, should we have an asterisk there letting people know that it's actually the county that pays for this program and not WMATA?
Absolutely, that's something we can do. And for anything like a fare subsidy buy-down program like that, I think that's an excellent point to include.
Yeah, just so there's no confusion.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I wanted to let everybody know Dave Snyder's on. I've been on for a few minutes. Thanks.
Hey, Dave, while you're there, do you have any comments on the presentation?
No, it sounded good. Thank you.
All right. Comments from our other commissioners? Looking around.
Mr. Chair, just briefly,
Yeah, Mr. DeFerranti.
Sure, the shift, I'm sure that in the 3 years you've learned, staff and you all as a NVTC as a commissioners have learned, but it does seem smart this year to be briefer and consolidate the way you have, so it looks good to me.
Thank you, Mr. DeFerranti. Any other commissioners? Any of our guests? Mr. Krisick, I can't see you, but since I can't hear you either, I'm going to assume you don't have any comments on this one.
No, thank you so much, Mr. Vice Chairman. I'm fine.
All right. Who's that?
Krizak. I'm learning. I'm just listening to you.
Okay. So I'd like to thank staff for all the work they've been putting into this. I know it hasn't been easy. So good job. I think Mr. Smedberg had a good comment, and let's keep the work coming so we can get this over to the full commission so we can have a little bit more robust discussion about it. All right.
Excellent, thank you. And so I'll just very quickly do the next steps for this, and then we'll move on to the next agenda item.
Sounds good.
Yep, I mean, essentially our next steps here to incorporate the guidance, do what we said we were going to do. We're going to draft over the summer, and then review that draft of the strategies chapter with this committee, probably at our September committee meeting, which we've not yet scheduled. And then we'll update other chapters as that data becomes available. And then this is probably going to be a December commission meeting item for approval to send to the Governor and General Assembly, as it is now due on December 15th. We were granted that extension in legislation this year, and key dates are over here on the right. So at that point, I will kick it back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Just really fast, any questions on procedural stuff for our timeline from anyone? I think everybody's looking good. Okay. Yep. Let's go ahead and kick it off with the next item, the 3% cap working group. This third agenda item is NVTC's 3% cap working group. Included in 2018 transit funding legislation in Virginia, WMATA is subject to a 3% cap on the annual growth in the operating subsidies that are paid by the compact jurisdictions, including NVTC jurisdictions. The General Assembly directed the NVTC chair to convene a working group to review the impact of the 3% cap. We had a presentation on the process for the working group in April, and tonight we'll review what the working group has discussed. Before I turn it over to staff, I'd like to ask Chair Crystal if she'd like to make any remarks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vice Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today, and am especially excited for you to hear from our staff about some of the discussions that they have been teeing up through some really excellent research into the trends of our payments, our jurisdictional subsidies to WMATA, what has been excluded from the cap, and the way that cap in reality has actually played out. I think this is a really meaningful issue for both our membership and support of the WMATA, of WMATA, and our goals to create a more interconnected multimodal region. And it's also important, perhaps more important than ever, as we struggle with significantly declining revenue sources. It's important for us to try to balance our local budgets. So the 3% cap is still relatively new. It went into effect after the 2018 legislation. But certainly it has been around long enough for us to recognize that it both aids the localities in predictability about our budgets, but can also stymie us and our objectives for WMATA's growth. So without much further conversation, I'm going to introduce staff, and then perhaps at the conclusion of their presentation, I can share a little more color commentary about the first conversation with the working group.
And I think at this point, we're probably going to kick it over to Zach for our presentation.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Next slide, please. All right. So I'll just begin with our charge from the General Assembly, which was, again, to convene a working group on the 3% cap on report on two things: the usefulness of the cap and whether any additional items should be excluded. Since my last report to the committee on the working group, we have completed our one-on-one discussions with each of the working group members, our stakeholders across the region, and met with Virginia's principal directors on the WMATA board just to gather their perspective on the cap as well. And so, as Chair Crystal said, the working group met last month, so now we're at a key point where we're beginning to coalesce all the comments that we've heard and use the data we've gathered to begin to assess the cap. Next slide. All right, and so here's just a list of our current working group participants. Chair Crystal serves as the chair of the working group as the chair of NVTC per the General Assembly's directive. The director of GRBT, Ms. Jennifer Mitchell, was also mentioned in the directive to be a required participant of the working group. We've included senior transportation officials from each of NVTC's jurisdictions to join us as well. And the General Assembly was less clear about the private sector stakeholders, but we are glad to have had the participation of those in our region who have an understanding of WMATA and our role in funding. So overall, our working group has really allowed us to have a roll up your sleeves conversation about the cap and sort of begin to peel back those layers of the operating subsidy bill. Next slide. All right, so I'll provide a brief background on the history of the 3% cap, just to provide more context for today's discussion. So the idea of a cap on operating subsidy assistance payments was first introduced by WMATA's general manager back in 2017 and was actually proposed as a cap on the total regional operating subsidy. So that would be Virginia, Maryland, and DC combined. But in 2018, the General Assembly took a different approach and applied a 3% cap on the annual growth of Virginia's operating subsidy payment. Maryland also applied a cap on their operating subsidy, and it has similar withholding language to ours. And there are some legislative exclusions that allow the operating subsidy payments to grow beyond that 3%. Any operating subsidy increases related to major capital projects, like Silver Line Phase 2, are excluded from the cap. Legal disputes involving WMATA, any FTA or DOT mandates for training or health and safety of employees, these are also excluded from the cap. This also includes any paratransit increases beyond that 3% are excluded as well. And our newest exclusion for any service increases approved by the WMATA board. This latest exclusion came out of the 2020 General Assembly and has not yet been applied, but the working group had a number of discussions on this and the other exclusions. So one other aspect of the cap that we discussed as a group is how it's being applied. As background, before the cap legislation, WMATA would use a historical formula to allocate the subsidy payment. And the primary inputs for that formula were around service related to Metro Rail, Metro Bus, and paratransit. Once the cap legislation was in effect, WMATA began to change its approach to developing the operating subsidy bill. And so essentially now, WMATA takes the previous year's operating subsidy total for Virginia, adds 3%, and then sub-allocates the payments to the jurisdictions using the historical formula. And so with this new approach, there have been some unintended consequences for the jurisdictions. And so what we've heard from them is that it's difficult to calculate what the actual cost of their service is and what they're paying for. And it's sort of challenging for them to do an analysis of WMATA because the bill isn't strictly tied to formula as it was in the past. Also, it's been difficult for WMATA to provide the bill by mode as they had in the past when it was strictly on the Metro Rail, Metro Bus, and paratransit. And that was an issue we heard across the jurisdictions and from our regional stakeholders as well. Next slide. So I've also included a synthesis of the conversations we had with each of the working group members about the cap and its exclusions. And so this is a very high-level summary of what was said. And I try to include comments where there was more than one person who mentioned a particular issue, but this is by no means an exhaustive list of what we heard about the cap. So on the usefulness of the cap, overall, the working group assessed the usefulness of the cap in terms of how it controlled the growth in operating subsidy payments. It appears that the cap is an effective tool to control those significant increases to the jurisdictional operating subsidy, but the group did acknowledge that it may be too soon to truly evaluate the effectiveness of the cap because it is so new. The General Assembly asked us to consider whether any additional items should be excluded from the cap. The general consensus was that there didn't need to be any additional exclusions, but there was a call for clarity on the current exclusions and how that would be helpful. But the working group did mention that this may be something for a body like CTB to address instead of legislation. But in particular, there was concern about the newest exclusion and to allow for board-approved subsidy increases and how it would impact their final bills and the sort of impact it has on the effectiveness of the cap. And so working group members talked about the recent FY21 budget development process and that there was friction between that process and applying the cap. Because there is a new approach to budgeting to apply the cap, there was a sense that it's more difficult for jurisdictions to calculate their bill, which impacts the transparency of the budget process. Like I said earlier, it's also hard to understand the analysis behind any proposed service reductions to meet the cap, and the jurisdictions in particular wanted to know the data behind changes that WMATA proposes when they do their budget development. And finally, because of the cap, as I mentioned, WMATA can't produce a bill by mode in the same way that they did before, and that's just what we heard loud and clear from the jurisdiction. And so we also recently conducted interviews with our regional partners to talk about the effect the cap has had on them. And so this presentation went out before those interviews were complete, so there is no particular slide on that. But I'll turn it over to Kate Mattice to give us an overview of what we heard from those other conversations.
Thank you, Zach. So indeed, we did have the opportunity. We thought it was quite important to hear from our colleagues in Maryland and in the District of Columbia, as well as talk to General Manager Wiedefeld and some of his staff to get all of their input. So in fact, just as of a little bit earlier this week, we had a chance to have all of those conversations. First of all, in talking to our Maryland and District colleagues, I have to say that they echo and amplify what we heard from our own jurisdictions. They have also found that there is a usefulness in having, even if it's sitting just on the Virginia and the Maryland side, knowing that there's something in place for cost controls is something that they found was very, very useful. They also, though, of course, did have some concerns about what it means to add exclusions or even the exclusions that are there. Again, just like our localities, they are concerned about their future budgets. And so they had a very similar approach to what they had. So as I mentioned, that there was a lot of similarities. And also, I think that they are looking for opportunities, just like we are, to continue working with WMATA staff to understand the budget development process. Having a 3% cap on the external and then a historic formula is, as Zach said, is a natural tension point. And so that's something I think that our colleagues in Maryland and DC, as well as our own jurisdictions, are really looking forward to continuing to work with WMATA staff to understand how that goes together. As I mentioned, I also had the opportunity to talk to General Manager Wiedefeld, as well as members from his budget staff. It was really good to hear a reminder of the historical context. And I know Zach provided that a little bit before, because indeed it was the general manager that envisioned a goal, an aspirational goal of controlling operating costs for them to go up no more than 3%. And so that's something that he said that, it was originally envisioned. It was never envisioned to be legislated. And so we'll just say that for what it is. But he said where it is right now is still very useful. He finds it very useful. He used the expression that it helps WMATA keep their pencils sharp and watching budget issues. So I think that was a really good affirming statement that we heard from him. I think that we did ask about the most recent legislative exclusion that was added, which was to add the board approved increases. The general manager did say that the original envisionment of having a 3% cap was exclusive of any board approved service increases. So the current legislative action in Virginia is intended to be consistent with the original vision that the general manager had. I'm trying to think if there's any other key things I want to highlight. Just as I said before, the WMATA staff do recognize that by putting a cap from an external purpose, especially because only on Virginia, not regionally, does come at conflict from creating something from a formula. It's just a natural sort of how can you put those things together? So there's a recognition that those are at odds. Having an outside cap and having a formula-based budget is something that is at conflict. And so there is a recognition there. But I think probably more important looking forward is I think that just like we all need to recognize the future budget impacts to WMATA as well as to all of our own localities under the current economic and health crisis is something we're obviously going to need to be watching very, very closely. The demands on the WMATA budget are not small, and also the loss of revenue from the ridership issues is something I think that we're going to continue to be needing to work with WMATA moving forward. So that pretty much summarizes. Again, I really appreciate that we had the chance to talk to our colleagues across the river. And I really think it's helpful to add to this dialogue. So thank you.
All right, next slide. All right, so I'll just turn it back over to the chair to kick off the discussion on the usefulness of the cap and its exclusion.
Thank you so much, Zach. Just want to give, if there's any other staff that had any quick comments, give them a quick chance. Oh, all right. I also wanted to give our chair, Katie Crystal, an opportunity if she had any closing remarks or comments.
Thank you so much. Just really want to thank Kate as well for doing that outreach to our neighboring jurisdictions, critically important perspectives since we are in this compact together. And want to also just take the opportunity to comment, as I did at our commission meeting 2 weeks ago, how much we appreciate the staff involvement. Every jurisdiction who participates in Northern Virginia Transportation Commission has sent usually the Director of Transportation, but someone with extensive subject matter expertise in the WMATA budget and also their jurisdictional budget. So it's really helpful to have those insights. The only thing I'd really just pull out, a real thread that I think was a major discussion in our first group, so this could be a good place to start with discussion with the committee, is this issue about the legislative exclusion. So we've seen actual jurisdictional subsidy growth hover around, and Zach can tell me if I'm getting these numbers wrong, but hover around 8 or 10%. So we've technically got this 3% cap on the books, but when you add all the exclusions in, it's not 3% at all. And so it sort of invited this question of, well, are we being limited on the things we might like to see, while at the same time this cap has not necessarily been reality. So I think that was a key theme. No resolutions or proposals yet, but definitely something of a comment of discussion. And so as we begin the conversation with this committee, that may be an area where others have thoughts as well.
Thank you, Chair Crystal. We're going to open it up now for discussion. I kind of got everybody up on the screen, so if you make some type of facial gesture or raise your hand, I'll be able to call on you. Mr. Turner, please.
Thank you all. Can you hear me okay? I apologize for any stupid question, but I'm the new guy, so I get to ask stupid questions. So the 3% cap, and as I understand, if I interpreted this correctly, Mr. Wiedefeld did not intend it to be a legislative cap. That tells me he intended it to be, we're going to really strive very hard not to exceed 3% on your subsidy payments, and that's our goal going forward. And Virginia said, we really appreciate that goal. That's a laudable goal, but just to make sure you live by it, we're going to pass legislation that says we're not paying more than 3%. And so my question first is it an actuarial correction if he goes over, or is it punitive because it said we cut off payments? Does that mean we cut off everything over 3%, or is a punitive measure, do we just shut down and not pay any subsidies until they come back and make that excess correct?
That's for a newbie, a pretty excellent articulation of how it all went down in 2018. So I will say, let me give you my answer, I think, and then Kate can certainly correct me if I've got it wrong. But because this was passed as a condition of the capital funding agreement in 2018, that funding, the capital funding from Virginia, is what's in jeopardy. Kate, if I got that right?
It's actually
no, Andrew's shaking his head.
Because everything is quite wonky. In fact, what it is actually the remaining DRPT funding for WMATA, which is not an insignificant amount. It has the potential of being withheld from CTB. There's a number of different exclusions, but it's a certain percentage, and Andrew, you can correct me exactly what it is, but they actually, if the 3% is blown, CTB can hold the other state money. And by the way, that state money is used by our localities to help pay their subsidy.
Good thing we've got Kate here. Just be out here freelancing with answers, not getting it right.
Mr. Letourneau, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer a little bit of the feedback that I had, and which is that, for those of you who are in local government, I kind of think of this cap as like fiscal guidance that you give to your staff at the beginning of the budget process. It's not the final decision. The board still has decisions to make, but it gives the staff some idea of where to shoot for when they produce a budget. And that's, I think kind of how it worked. I communicated to the group that I found it useful in kind of constraining some of the discussion with my colleagues on the WMATA board, because the general manager had those restraints to stay kind of within that realm. Obviously there are exclusions, new services among them. So that I think is alleviated some of the concern about the ability for the system to grow as needed. But the other point that I'll make is Metro has operated in a very difficult labor environment for some time, and previous bargaining situations have been challenging because for lack of a better term, trying to choose my words carefully. The funding side of Metro was sort of seen as an open-ended place where, there's kind of limitless resources and whatever bill is sent is paid. And so I think in this environment, there was a labor agreement. It was mostly negotiated before I came on the board. Chair Smedberg may have some commentary about that, but there's been, I think, kind of a little bit more productivity to that because there was an understanding that Metro had a limit and had only had access to a certain number of funds. So, and that, is similar to what we deal with in our governments, obviously, but I think that changed the framework of the conversation a little bit when it comes to issues. And from a cost standpoint, I think now more than ever, the feedback that Paul and I have been receiving consistently over the last 4 or 5 months is we're going to have difficulty making our payments. As jurisdictions, we're having to really cut corners and we have to provide help to our citizens, but we don't have a lot of room for growth in our budgets. And certainly, we're aware of concerns that happening at the various state levels as well. So this ends up being probably a useful tool going forward as well, particularly in this environment, albeit I wish there was more transparency and I wish it was applied differently by WMATA. And that's a conversation that we continue to have. So that was kind of my perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Letourneau. Any other commission members, some comments? Mr. Smedberg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I largely agree with Matt. The 3% in a lot of ways has been a helpful tool, particularly in this time and through various negotiations and, not only with labor, but with, capital projects and other things. So, by and large, it's been favorable. Clearly, is an issue in my mind. They're fairly large at times. You could drive a truck through them. So to Ms. Crystal's comment of, is 3% an actual reality? Good question. But in general, I think it has served a useful purpose and could potentially even be more helpful in the coming months and probably at least 2-3 years ahead of us here. Actually, I have a question for Ms. Tice, if I could. Kate, could you give us a sense of, you mentioned the jurisdictional, you talked to a group of jurisdictional representatives. Could you give us a sense of what their positions were or are, what are they from the private sector? Are these government related representatives, legislative representatives? I'm sort of curious because at times we hear the exact opposite of what you reported out.
So the individuals that I met with were actually the funding jurisdictions. So I actually had an opportunity to meet with somebody from the DC CFO's office, as well as DC DOT, and then also over staff that we work with all the time on JCC from Maryland. So these were folks who are day-to-day focused on WMATA and WMATA budget issues.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. That helps. Yeah.
But could I ask, Mr. Spedberg, were you asking about the folks Kate spoke with in Maryland in the district, or were you asking about the membership of the committee?
No. In the Maryland, in the district.
Okay.
Mr. DeFerrante, did you want to jump in there?
Sure, briefly. I mean, I think there's context on the breadth of the 4 exclusions that are listed in the presentation that I will want to learn and will work on learning. But with respect to the 4th and the board, it does, just from the few full commission meetings I've been in, it does really appear that both of you, Matt and Paul, have really used this. I guess just in a bold initial thought is, I wonder if, if some budgets in different states have like significant majorities, like 2/3 requirements. And I just wanted to surface that as a thought. And I'm wary that, you guys on the board may feel like we are at a moment where we need additional flexibility. But I do feel as though you don't want a strict, tough rule that can never respond to events, but it does seem like the 4 exceptions are large enough. And I wondered if that thought of maybe a 2/3 or 5 votes out of 7 could be useful as we consider going forward.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
So, interesting thing about the WMATA board is every jurisdiction technically has a veto. If both members of the board oppose something. And so that certainly helps to keep conversations within the realm of broad agreement between the jurisdictions and the board members and so on. So
not necessary.
Yeah, I mean, because of that dynamic, which is, a deeper issue, it becomes, kind of the point, I guess. But I mean, the one thing that I would kind of raise for maybe discussion and maybe just for Kate Matthijs to kind of weigh in on a little is this notion of a jurisdictional cap versus a regional cap. Because I think that's kind of where there's some need for further analysis.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in.
Yeah.
Taking a step back to where this was originally envisioned in General Manager Wiedefeld's plan several years ago, did talk about it being a WMATA full budget, all jurisdictions, growth from year to year as a target of 3%. And so when things came down to the drafting of the legislation, they were changed in Virginia to say Virginia, and in Maryland actually also put they almost identical language, but Virginia does have the word Virginia in it. And so it was within that legislative drafting that it went from being an idea of an overall WMATA approach to being sort of state jurisdiction level. So that is the way the legislation is written right now. My understanding is that there were some early suggestions that may change in this legislative session, but that actually did maintain the word Virginia in it. So that is definitely something that when talking to Mr. Wiedefeld, he'd be very interested in having that referred to a regional approach. I am not a lawyer, but my sense is there may be some difficult, if you do have it sitting in Virginia law, Maryland law, that there may be some issues with putting something that goes outside of the boundaries of that jurisdiction. And so I think that may be the reason why state to state, that might be an area for discussion.
Regina, did you want to, Ms. Sullivan?
No, I just could follow up and say that the community does not have any language on this.
Ms. Sullivan, we're having trouble hearing you.
I'm sorry, hold on 1 second. I apologize. Turn my volume up. Can you hear me now? Better? Sorry. I'm sorry. The district doesn't have a cap on it on the in statute.
Ms. Sullivan, I'm sorry, it might be the connection. I still can't understand you.
Oh, no. Hold on. Sorry. apologize. Can you hear me now?
So
Yeah, connection's a little poor.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Smedberg, if you don't mind, I want to give Mr. Bell a chance to jump in.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess I want to make two comments. One, I think Mr. Letourneau, Supervisor Letourneau, described the intention correctly, and I think a lot of people felt like that, and I think that it's a good guideline. But I do like the suggestion, perhaps, of maybe we could go and tweak the language of a 2/3 type of vote for extraordinary times, and certainly COVID has brought that to bear. I think that would be a good consideration as part of the feedback.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Mr. Smedberg?
Yeah. Question either for Ms. Crystal or
Mr. Smedberg, you're breaking up too.
Bill or full. Talk about a bill being introduced in Maryland that would do away with the 3%.
Mr. Smedberg, your question kind of came in and out. Who are you directing to?
Mr. Chair, I'm hearing a lot of echoing. There's a lot of echoing in the background. It's like a hollow sort of sound that permeates across everything. A very strong signal here. I don't know if others are hearing it.
Mr. Chairman, Dave Snyder, can you hear me okay?
Mr. Snyder, I can hear you, yeah. Mr.
Sure.
Try and come back to your question after Mr. Snyder.
Okay, sure. So I think the group that looked at this arrived at a pretty clear consensus, and I think Matt Letourneau well expressed the procedural aspects. So I'm pretty satisfied with the way things are right now, and I'd be a little reluctant to carve out even more exceptions. And I think the one that, if the board votes for a change in service, that could break through the 3% cap. I have a little concern about how broad that is and how not certainly this board and certainly not our representatives, but it does allow for some circumvention of the 3% that I don't think was necessarily originally intended. But the bottom line for me is I think the group got it right. I think it serves a valuable purpose. I'd like it maintained, and I would be reluctant to add additional yet more exceptions. So that's all I really wanted to say at this point. I'm very impressed with the work that's been done so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. Mr. Smedberg, did you try one more time, and then we might jump to Ms.
I'll try one more time. Thank you. A question for Ms. Crystal or Ms. Matthijs. Was there any mention of the possible legislation in Maryland to get rid of the 3%?
So we did not talk about that. I do know that there was legislation in Maryland this year that did make some changes, but it's been vetoed by the governor. So it would be awaiting action next year. And so there are not any current changes to Maryland law that are in place.
Okay. And
you can hear me? You all hear me better?
Ms. Sullivan, we're going to let Mr. Smedberg, unless
sorry,
you're addressing Mr. Smedberg's question. Okay. Mr. Smedberg.
And for Mr. DeFerrante, to explain again this concept of the two. I mean, I understand the concept of the 2/3 vote, but what do you think that gets us, given how WMATA operates and what Mr. Letourneau said? Is that for us?
Sure. So I had known the jurisdictional effective veto, but I had not recalled it. Of course, I read about it in the past, but I actually don't think that the addition would be too significant. I guess there could be scenarios where the two individuals in each jurisdiction might not vote together. But I think Mr. Letourneau's response was satisfying to me, at least, that there is some, you want not to see that exception is so broad, and the jurisdictional veto seems to me to satisfy.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Chuck, so did you want to add anything? Okay. Ms. Sullivan?
Better now? Okay, hear me? I haven't had any problems all day. I'm not.
All right. Thanks, Ms. Sullivan. Let's see. I wanted to give a couple of our guests a chance if they had any questions. Ms. Paltrow, did you have anything? All right. Mr. Chris?
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Quick question. Does Maryland have, with their 3% cap, do they have the same exact exceptions to the cap?
I believe they do currently in law, but there were some legislative actions that were looking to change that. And I know Regina's having a tough time getting through, so I might actually have her send me any responses, old school or oldest school, and I'm happy to pass those along if you have anything to add, Regina.
Mr. Chair, if I could.
Yes, go ahead.
I think some of the discussions, Delegate Krizak, were centered around labor-related issues, and there were proposals coming forward from labor organizations to get rid of the 3%. Very hard. Force was behind that legislation was solely from the labor groups.
Yeah, I'm starting to hear the feedback too. If I could remind everybody just to put yourself on mute if you're not speaking, that way we can reduce some of the feedback that's happening.
Anything, Mr. Chairman, Delegate Krizak,
go ahead.
Is there anything magic with 3% versus 4% or 5%?
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to provide some insights from what I heard on the folks that we interviewed. There actually was some sort of high-level calculations, but it's quite possible that there wasn't necessarily magic to the 3%. It was just a target. And again, it was come up at a time when it was not intended to be legislated nor have withholding parameters associated with it.
I mean, Mr. Chairman, I remember this was really a way for the party that was in power at the time in the General Assembly to kind of to wasn't punish WMATA, but it was to let them know who was boss. And also there was a lot of amendments to that bill that I think we've changed since then, and we certainly didn't like. So in the General Assembly, I think we would be amenable certainly to getting rid of the cap or making it more flexible if necessary. It's just because it was something that was imposed upon us by our predecessors. But I'm hearing that perhaps it's a good tool to have. But I am also concerned that if labor feels that it's too constraining, then perhaps it really is.
Thank you, Mr. Krizak. Do we have anyone else that wants to provide some comments? Taking a look around, not seeing anyone. All right. So staff, you guys have enough information to keep on moving forward with this?
I think we do. Just a couple more slides for you. Next slide, please. All right, and I just wanted to go over a couple additional things with you all. So now that we've discussed the current cap, the next few slides are just focused on guiding possible recommendations the working group may have on a cap or another possible tool. Next slide. So the working group hasn't finalized any position on a particular recommendation on the cap to the General Assembly, so they may explore no legislative changes and maintain status quo, but alternatives or modifications to the current cap has come up in various meetings. The feasibility of some of these suggestions are unknown, but the working group will discuss these at our next meeting in July. And as you can see on the screen, there are a number of different recommendations or possible solutions to the cap, but like I said, we're going to explore a little bit deeper at our July working group meeting. Next slide. So as the working group evaluates any potential change to the cap, there was discussion regarding principles about what a cap should do. This list isn't all-inclusive, and a cap may not be able to do all of these things. But as we examine the cap and refine our recommendations, these may be helpful to consider moving forward. So regarding the principles, the first one, just looking at any solution through an equity lens, and that is supportive of an equitable transit system, was heard very loud and clear from our working group members. As you've heard before, having a predictable budget and allowing jurisdictions the ability to add or reduce service was important to them as well. Ideally, an alternative or modification to the cap would integrate with WMATA's budget process, ensuring that jurisdictions are able to get that bill by mode and making sure service reductions or increases are accurately reflected in the operating subsidy bill. We've looked at the historical operating subsidies, and there was a sentiment of not returning to years where the operating subsidy increases were very significant from year to year. And moving forward, just maintaining a fiscally responsible approach to growth in the operating subsidy was important to the working group as well. Next slide. All right, so Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back over to you to see if there's any feedback or comments about our guiding principles on the cap.
All right, going to open it up one more time for discussion.
Mr. Chair, Dave Snyder, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Snyder.
Again, thanks a lot for great work on this. You know, we've got a lot of issues out there we're going to have to address in the next couple of years. I don't need to run through the list. We're all grappling with some horrendous challenges that we didn't have 6 months ago. I think from what I'm hearing, the cap is working reasonably well. And I don't see a need for major change. And I don't see a need to spend a lot more time on this. I mean, you know, others may feel differently, and that's fine. But I think the end result is we've got a pretty good thing that's working pretty well. And I don't see a need to really open it up at this point, considering everything else that we're challenged to do. So thanks much.
Mr. Vice Chairman.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Ms. Crystal.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say, Mr. Snyder, that was really helpful. And I think that's actually a bit of a takeaway I have from this meeting in general. The one sort of contextual thing to note is that this legislative requirement to study the 3% cap resulted from a proposal in the General Assembly by a Northern Virginia delegate to remove the 3% cap. Right. So, you know, I think it maybe just bears repeating that we may not be interested in this issue, but this issue is interested in us. And so I think, you know, we need to be able to have sort of a clear standing from our working group and the commission one way or another. So I think that's a really, really helpful point. I just wanted to add that bit of context about why we're doing this and why it's important to carry forward.
Oh yeah, I mean, I obviously I agree with you totally. The only point I was trying to make was it seems like so far at least the general sense is that it's working pretty well. And so I just hope we don't upset it at this point and create issues, considering we have a lot of other issues that are real that somehow, Kate, have found us.
Thanks.
Anyway, thanks so much. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I just have one option, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Mr. Meyer.
I agree with Mr. Snyder completely on this, and you've got these 5 bullets. I've read them carefully. I get it. And I only want to make an observation. I am not suggesting we change anything. But 3 years ago, it was all about state of good repair and addressing the need for a safety culture within WMATA. And I see no reference to either of those in any specific way. Granted, those 2 items or those 2 concepts really undergird all of the 5 bullets here. But I just make a note that we ought not to forget those 2 points, which were really drivers to the whole issue of additional capital funding sources, which then in turn created a demand for a cap. So that's all I'll say at this point. But I just wanted to note that for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Yes, I think safety is always something that we need to keep at top of mind. Mr. Smedberg, were you trying to get in there?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. I just wanted to say, following up on Ms. Crystal's comment, this topic has found us, but I think it also highlights to me, listening to Kate and others speak and looking at the presentation before the meeting, it also highlights, the trade-offs. And I think it got a lot of people thinking about, the positives and potentially some of the real, negative things about this, but yet, you seem to have come to a reasonable conclusion here. But I think it has highlighted the trade-offs for a lot of folks, and not only your jurisdictions, but the Commonwealth, then the authority itself is going to be going into a really, really challenging time for the foreseeable future. So, this report really does come at, it's actually very timely, and us understanding all those trade-offs and how we're going to move together or move forward together. So.
Definitely. Thank you, Mr. Smedberg. Let's see. Mr. Bell, were you trying to get in there?
No, I'm good. I must have forgot to lower my hand last time. Thank you.
No problem. Just want to double check. Okay. Was that somebody else?
Yeah, just briefly, Mr. Chair, this is Mr. DeFerranti. I guess I think broadly, the comments made seem appropriate. I would have a little bit of deference just to our representatives, the 2 of you, with respect to bullets 2 and 3, if you think that if there are procedural protections with respect to what the changes being done on budgets that you 2 or you as well, Mr. Chair, thought would be appropriate to add, that would be the only, and I would be fully inclined to. There are certainly the procedures of the WMATA board are written about much, but if there were additions that you want to do that, and in consultation with staff, that would be the only thought I would have, in addition to the broad points that Mr. Snyder and Ms. Crystal made.
Mr. Chairman, just in response to Mr. DeFerranti, I think you're talking about 2 and 3 about balancing budget predictability and yeah, I mean, so I think 2 is largely sort of taken care of already with the exclusions that exist. And we saw that during the last budget process. There were reductions of service, but there actually were some additions to service as well that the jurisdiction that wanted those increases paid for. And so I think that flexibility is there. I completely agree about the transparency issue. I'm not sure that's a cap issue necessarily, other than the fact that, quite frankly, I think Regina can block her ears, I think WMATA uses the cap sometimes as a little bit of a screen to be a little less transparent as they could be, and that's something the board's working on. I think Paul and I have talked about next year's budget process from a procedural standpoint already. I believe that we need to have actual budget work sessions. In the finance committee, we shouldn't just show up and then sort of be thrust into voting on things without having a chance to really talk it through. And I think, it's a frustration that you hear from your jurisdictional staff about some of these issues. So I think there are improvements that need to be made there. I don't think we need to make a change to the 3% cap to do that, because it need to happen regardless. And it's really up to the WMATA board to, try to work with the staff to improve those processes. So I guess that would be my reaction on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeFronte, and thank you, Arno. We have other comments from our commissioners. Any comments from staff? All right. Zach, anything else?
Just next step. Next slide. Next slide, thanks. Just in terms of next steps, our next working group meeting is actually July 30th, where we'll review the feedback from this committee, review the discussions we've had with our counterparts across the jurisdiction, still continue that data gathering, just making sure we understand the historical operating subsidies and the impact they've had on our jurisdictions. And then we will have a report prepared by the next meeting, the next WMATA committee meeting in September, and then subsequent action by the commission in the fall. Next slide. And then these are just our key dates of what I just explained in the previous slide.
All right.
I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Zach. Any questions on our working group?
Mr. Chair, if I could, this is Kate Mattias. I do want to give a real shout out to staff, and especially Zach Smith on his efforts. It's been absolutely amazing putting together all of these working groups and interviews. He really done a phenomenal job on this so far. So a big thanks to Zach.
Absolutely. Thanks to Zach. And
Mr.
Who's that?
This is Paul.
Go ahead, Mr. Smember.
Thank you. Ms. Mattias, quick question for you. With the report being due in November, it's one thing just reading a report, and another thing reading a report and hearing from some of the authors. Do you think you, NVTC, will have an opportunity to actually brief out the two chairs or the DRPT director on this?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. I apologize.
In other words, will you be able to orally present it to them, as well as handing it over?
Oh, we absolutely, thank you, to the General Assembly. That's absolutely something we'll work with Amy on making possible.
Thanks.
All right. Any other commissioners? Okay. I think that's going to close our conversation on the 3% cap working group. Staff, I think you guys have what you need, and we're going to go ahead and move on to agenda item number 4, which is the WMATA Transit Equity Framework. For this agenda item, I wanted to take some time to hear from our Virginia members of the WMATA board on the recent introduction of the WMATA Transit Equity Framework and the agency's efforts to advance equitable transit. Equity has been kind of a buzzword for the last couple of years, but buzzwords don't mean much if we don't actually take some action on them. So I was really pleased with what we're going to try and move forward with at WMATA, and excited to hear from our board members a little bit further.
Okay. Matt,
Paul, do you want to start? Why don't you take?
I'm sorry.
I said, why don't you get us started, Paul?
Yeah, and you can chime in. All right. Thank you, Chair Gary. So last week, the WMATA Executive Committee received a presentation on the Transit Equity Framework. I'm actually on that little working group as chair, working with the general manager and Stephanie Gibbide, who's one of the DC representatives on the board, as well as a handful of WMATA employees. And the purpose of the Transit Equity Framework is to advance equitable policies and practices that support WMATA's mission. The framework outlines specific areas, including policing, public participation, fares and service, sustainability, contracting and performance reporting, and that'll be, the primary focus of the review and any potential action plans. Some actions already underway include a task force comprised of board members and management, which I just mentioned, that will specifically address and discuss transit equity at all levels of the organization. A new independent Metro Transit Police Department, or MTPD, investigations review panel, and we've just recently put out a call for people to apply for that panel. And last and third, reexamination of policies and practices around public participation. And in the coming months, the board will undergo or undertake a series of trainings on race and transit equity. The board will also receive quarterly performance reports during the board meetings, and this is something that I and others have been, sort of working toward anyway, to ensure transparency and addressing customer care and other related issues. So those are the main, sort of areas that we've been focusing in on. The trainings for the board will be done in open, like we do our ethics and other types of trainings, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. We'll also be doing a review of if we have any out-of-date policies, still on the books and procedures. That's sort of that's Mr. Wiedefeld has made that sort of an ongoing process, and we'll just, continue with that, maybe amp it up a little bit. We'll also be looking at the RAC and how the various members of the RAC are, not only selected, but how the RAC interacts, with various aspects of or various areas of the organization. In fact, we have a call out for RAC members as well. Matt and I will have to review the Virginia applications, and we'll be talking about that shortly. So those are the things that we're focusing in on, and and we thought it was important to do that, just sort of to set some expectations. As the chair said, there's been a lot of talk about this recently, and it's become a buzzword or a buzz phrase, so to speak. But please know that WMATA has been fairly engaged, in this kind of activity already at multiple levels through a lot of what Mr. Wiedefeld and other senior management has been doing in their various departments and various forms of outreach. So we hope to to take a review of that and see if we can do things even better. Matt, do you want to add some of your thoughts and comments? And I guess the one big thing, and I sort of left out, I didn't leave it out, but maybe something, Matt, you want to talk about a little bit, and that is the bus transformation issue and service equity there.
Yeah, and appreciate that, Paul. And I agree with you that, my observation of the general manager and the kind of the culture is that this has been an issue that has been taken seriously for quite some time, not just now when it's kind of in the national consciousness, and that we're all very aware, and especially those of us on the commission here are aware of the ways that transit can play a role in bringing opportunity and equity to underprivileged communities. So speaking about bus in particular, there's one statistic I'll share that kind of underscores why bus is kind of the focus here, which is that rail ridership right now is about 9% of what it normally would be, which is about 60,000 trips per weekday. Bus ridership is about 30% of normal, which is about 120,000 trips weekday. And that has been fairly consistent. Bus ridership never fell off as much and came back, is coming back faster than rail ridership. And, there's some obvious reasons for that, namely that the bus systems serve communities that are essential workers, and they need metro and they need options to get to where they need to go. And they need to be able to serve their businesses and so on, and the public at large. So the bus transformation study that Metro did had kind of contemplated some of these issues. And there's a lot of different things, that can be pared down from that and looked at with that. Fare policy is certainly one of them. I do think it was unfortunate. I'm sure you guys pay attention to, all of the Metro coverage. I felt like the Washington Post story that covered the last Metro board meeting on Thursday was a little deceptive because it sort of led with the notion that the board is undertaking a study of essentially eliminating bus fares. That was a comment that one of the 8 board members made. I wouldn't say it was reflecting the position of the jurisdiction, and I think it was sort of the type of comment that's also kind of a question, which, those of us that go to a lot of these meetings are familiar with. So I felt like that headline kind of misconstrued the true nature of that conversation and the directness by which maybe the board is looking at that. There are, I think, some significant issues there because at the same breath we're talking about equity and opportunity in ways that we can improve things, we're also talking about a financial crisis, and we're talking about a massive reduction in revenue, and we're talking about state budgets that are going to be short, county budgets that are going to be short, city budgets, and so on. So those two things are kind of in conflict, and that's going to make for a very difficult FY22 budget discussion. There were some fare policy changes that were made for FY21 in the budget that were not implemented because they do have higher costs associated with them. They would have increased jurisdictional subsidy. And, as a board, we were very sensitive to, and the general manager was very sensitive to what we're hearing from our jurisdictions, which is that we don't want to have to let people go. We want to continue to provide service for them, all services for them. So please, Metro, do what you can to reduce your expenses. So that's going to be the push and pull. Hopefully that's more of a short-term issue than a long-term one, but we don't really know. I mean, there's a lot of theories out there about how quickly ridership is going to come back on Metro. So I do want to mention that. That said, I think it's worth our while to think about bus service in particular. There is a program, a pilot program that the district has done where they are paying down fares for certain individuals. And, that is certainly one approach that's done by jurisdiction, so that if a jurisdiction wants to do that, they can do that. I think it's much more difficult to talk about that for WMATA as a whole, because there's going to be just fundamentally sort of inequities in terms of who's paying for what and who's buying down, whose reduction and so on. There's just so many different pieces. There's not going to be the benefit received is not going to be the same throughout the jurisdictions for something like that. But that is something that's on the table. And so I think, at this point, the board has really asked the staff to drill down on some of these issues, take a look at routes, take a look at, where there are opportunities to potentially provide some more service, or what the appetite is in the jurisdictions to pay for some of these initiatives, because they do have costs associated with them. There are certainly some that are designed to increase ridership, where maybe they generate a little more revenue. And in our budget process, there's kind of a modeling aspect when there are initiatives where staff goes and does an analysis and determines, kind of how that equates. So, that process typically needs to begin several months before the budget is adopted. So I think this is a good conversation to have now and through the fall to think about the policies in particular that we may want to look at, as a way to do that. And then the final point I'll make is continue to make that Virginia is in a little bit of a different situation, as is, somewhat Montgomery County and a little bit Prince George's, because we operate our own bus services. Loudoun County has opted out of Metro Bus completely. So any of the Metro Bus discussion is not going to be a benefit that Loudoun County residents receive. And some of the other jurisdictions, they are dependent on Metro to varying degrees, but they have their own. You have your own systems, whether it's Fairfax Connector or so on. The district does not. And so that makes this a very different kind of discussion for the district than it does for ours, because they don't have the opportunity to add service in any other way. And so they did add some service, even in the last budget, at their own expense through the way that was calculated. But it is something to think about as we talk about kind of the regional bus picture and the regional network. And I do think it's a legitimate discussion to discuss how much service should WMATA be providing in the jurisdictions that have their own bus service, and how much should we just pick up on our own. And if there's going to be a reduction of WMATA's bus service, then there needs to also be a reduction in subsidy and resource allocation so that those jurisdictions can devote those resources into providing that service themselves. There's got to be kind of a 1-for-1 on that if that moves forward. So I'll kind of stop there, but those are some of the discussions kind of swirling around.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Letourneau, and thank you, Mr. Smedberg. Were there any quick comments or questions for our two principal board members? Okay. Sorry, 1 second, everybody. So, just so you guys are aware, my laptop's trying to restart itself, and I'm trying to get onto another laptop at the same time because I can't seem to be able to stop it. I've been watching this countdown for like the last half hour. But I wanted to take a quick second to talk on one other thing. I brought up, I think last year, staff and I had talked about this some research on the low-income fare products across pure transit agencies. We asked staff to kind of keep tabs on that issue, and I wanted to throw it over to staff to see if they had any updates or if there's anything we should be aware of.
Thank you, Chair. You're right. This is Andrew DeVetter at NVTC. I'll filibuster while you figure out your computer. But as the Chair mentioned last year, the committee, staff gave the committee an update on our research on low-income fare products across peer agencies, and the committee asked us to keep tabs on any developments. And so it's been a year, and there are new developments. As Mr. Letourneau mentioned, the district introduced a pilot program for low-income fare pass product pilot program, which was approved by the Metro Board earlier this year. Alexandria was also awarded a COG grant to explore how to implement a low-income fare pass program. The study there should begin in the fall and provide recommendations in early 2021. I will examine different fare options, program administration costs, and ridership impacts. And then additionally, the Virginia Transit Association, VTA, has a TANF, Temporary Aid for Needy Families, grant program for fiscal 21. This is a free transit fare for working families grant program. It's competitive, and it was funded through Virginia's biennial budget. This program offers free transit passes for TANF eligible persons, and the application window there recently closed. And lastly, Virginia's 2020 Transportation Omnibus legislation created and funded the Transit Ridership Incentive Program. So this is new, and this is out of DRPT, and it's providing funding for the creation and improvement of transit routes of regional significance. In addition to that, 25% of TRIP funds will be dedicated to establishing statewide low-income fare-free pilot programs. This is separate from VTA's TANF program, but both of those programs are aiming to provide financial relief to transit riders throughout the Commonwealth. DRPT did hire a project manager and expects to issue a call for projects at some point during fiscal 21. So a lot of new developments from the last year, especially out of Virginia's recent budget and transportation funding bill, and so still pretty early in these, but I did want to give that update to the committee. And if the chair is back, I will hand it over to him. I'm not sure if the chair is back. Well, in the meantime, oh wait, here he is. Chair Gary, are you back? Can you hear me? Chair Gary, can you hear me? I just finished the update,
Andrew,
and I think it's time to.
While we're waiting, should we maybe go around the table?
Yeah, at this point, let's go ahead and open it up for any questions, since that is the next step in the agenda. Do we have any questions to the comments from Mr. Smedberg and Mr. Letourneau? At this point, I will sort of the usual shout method.
Sure. I mean, I'll just help move us along. I thought that.
Sure thing. Thanks, Matt.
Mr. DeFranti, I'm just saying, I just thought that it's helpful because everyone has used for the last 6 months the word equity. So it's helpful to hear both of your thoughts, and there's detail there, and certainly I'll be interested, but I don't feel that much to add at this stage other than thank you to both of you.
And Chairman Gary, if I can jump in, I did just get an update from Ms. Sullivan that the DC low-income fare product was not funded. So that was new information to me, and I wanted to just make sure that it was part of that update. So thank you.
No, thank you so much. And I missed, I apologize, I missed part of the conversation, but were there any other comments from any of our commissioners? Or did we already kind of go through that part?
We had just opened it up, Mr. Chair.
All right. Looking around, anybody else have any comments? I feel like we lost some people, but maybe it's just the new laptop. Okay. If there's not any other comments, I guess we'll go on to item number 5. And this is basically just other items of jurisdictional importance. Anybody have anything for the good of the order? Nothing. Oh, all right. Looks like we might get everybody out of here a little bit early.
Here, Mr. Chairman, let me just yes, I feel like I should. There was a train derailment last week. There was also at that same Metro Board meeting a discussion of the Farragut West incident. The Metro Board has been concerned about some of these ongoing safety issues, obviously. And the staff as well, the leadership, have been working on changes. There have been some public announcements made about some changes being made at the Rail Operations Control Center. So I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail. I'm happy to answer questions, perhaps individually from those who might have them, and I'm sure Paul would be too. But suffice to say that the board is very engaged at this point on these issues. We know that the system needs to be safe, that the culture needs to be a safety culture. I did ask questions about automatic train control as a potential remedy to human error that is occurring with some of these incidents. And the staff has been evaluating some options, and we'll be discussing this further with the board. Whether the system that was in place previously can be still used, or whether there needs to be a whole new system, has been part of the evaluation that they're undertaking. But just please know that it has been an issue for us. We have spent a lot of time on it. The general manager is taking it very seriously, and hopefully we can continue to make progress on it. So I'll kind of leave it at that.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lickman. Yes, Mr. Smedberg.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, and Matt and others, so we've had a couple of conversations with the general manager since our meeting, Matt, and we too are going to be taking this, being more present during this discussion. So we, the board, so we'll get a thorough update next week on how they see things moving forward.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Smedberg. Any other commissioners for this agenda item? Staff, any comments for this agenda item? All right. So, Mr. DeFerranti, did you have something? No. All right. So before we adjourn, I just want to mention one thing real fast. Staff had invited the WMATA General Manager, Paul Wiederfield, to come speak before the commission originally in April, but of course with the pandemic that was happening, we canceled that, but he is scheduled to come in September. So we'll make sure that everybody's aware of that. I also wanted to provide a look ahead for the fall. Staff will be scheduling a September committee meeting, which will be an important meeting to hear one last time from the 3% working group. The 3% report will be reviewed by the committee and the commission before it is sent to the General Assembly in November. The same goes for the annual report on WMATA. The committee will preview it before it goes to the commission and is sent to the General Assembly. Staff may need to schedule an additional committee meeting in October or November, just so we can look things over some more, and we'll evaluate the need for any additional meetings as staff work progresses. And that's about it. So I want to thank everybody for hanging in there with all the technical difficulties we're having tonight. And I'm sure I will see you guys sooner than later. So thank you all again, and this meeting is adjourned for tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.